In the United States, 14 executions are currently scheduled for 2026 across 3 states: Texas, Tennessee, and Ohio. In this video, we will examine who these inmates are, the crimes that led to their death sentences, and where each case stands today. But before we start, let us know in the comment where you're watching from. This is Verdict Vault. Stay with us. Gerald R. Hand. By the early 2000s, Gerald R. Hand was already deeply familiar with the criminal justice system. His record included violent offenses, and he was not living freely when the crime that sealed his fate occurred. Hand was an inmate, restrained, supervised, and being moved under law enforcement control. The man responsible for that supervision on the day everything went wrong was Deputy Timothy Grease of the Richland County Sheriff's Office, a veteran officer, a husband, and a father who had spent years doing routine prisoner transports without incident. That routine would not hold. On February 2, 2002, Hand was being transported for a court appearance in Mansfield, Ohio. Unbeknownst to the officers escorting him, Hand had secretly obtained a handcuff key, a small object that prosecutors later argued was evidence of planning, not impulse. During the transport, Hand freed himself. In a confined space with limited reaction time, the balance of control shifted in seconds. According to trial testimony, Hand attacked the officers and gained control of a firearm. Deputy Timothy Grease was shot at close range. He did not survive. Another officer was also shot but lived, later providing crucial testimony about what happened inside that transport vehicle. For prosecutors, the case was clear. This was not panic, and it was not accidental. They argued the killing was deliberate, carried out after Hand created the opportunity to strike. Hand was quickly subdued and taken into custody. At trial, jurors heard evidence highlighting the hidden handcuff key, the intentional targeting of law enforcement, the extreme danger posed by an inmate willing to kill while restrained. The defense raised issues related to mental health and intent, but jurors ultimately rejected those arguments. Gerald Hand was convicted of aggravated murder with death penalty specifications and sentenced to death. Hand's conviction and sentence were reviewed and upheld by the Ohio Supreme Court. Federal courts later declined to overturn the verdict. Legally, the case reached its end, but Ohio's death penalty system did not. Ohio has not carried out an execution since 2018. Governors have repeatedly postponed executions, citing inability to obtain lethal injection drugs, ongoing legal challenges, and broader concerns about the system itself. As a result, Gerald Hand remains on death row, sentenced to die. Publicly available rosters show Gerald Hand's earliest scheduled execution is June 17, 2026. His case now exists in a legal limbo, sentenced to die, but efforts to carry out executions in Ohio have stalled in recent years, in part due to difficulty obtaining lethal injection drugs. But Hand's case continues to be among those listed for future execution once state procedures allow.
Krista Gale Pike. On September 30, 2026, Tennessee plans to execute its only woman on death row, a woman whose crime shocked a community nearly 3 decades ago and left questions about age, influence, and consequence that continue to divide opinion. Krista Gale Pike was just 18 years old, barely an adult, when the events that would define her life unfolded in 1995. She was a student in the Knoxville Job Corps program, a federal job training initiative that brought young adults together to learn skills and find direction. Pike was not isolated. She lived with classmates, roommates, friends, including 19-year-old Colleen Slemmer, another Job Corps student. They had shared meals, classrooms, and the everyday details of young life in a residential program. But beneath the surface of that community were tensions that would erupt into violence. On a winter night in January of 1995, Pike and 2 others, her boyfriend, 17-year-old Tadaryl Shipp, and friend Shadola Peterson, then 18, approached Colleen Slemmer with what looked like a casual outing. Prosecutors later described that Pike lured Slimmer to a secluded area on the University of Tennessee agricultural campus, an isolated place where no one else would witness what followed. Once there, what had begun as a walk among peers turned into an hour of brutal violence. Court records and news reporting indicate that Pike and Shipp beat and stabbed Slimmer repeatedly. During the attack, they carved a pentagram into her chest, an image prosecutors linked to Pike's interest in occult symbols. The assault did not end quickly. Witness testimony at trial established that the attack continued long enough that Pike and her accomplices had time to mutilate the victim further, and, according to prosecutors, Pike took a piece of Slimmer's skull with her as she left the scene. This was not a moment of sudden rage alone, but a prolonged, coordinated attack, a level of violence that would become central to her conviction. Investigators later learned that Pike was jealous, believing, without clear evidence, that Slimmer was trying to steal Shipp away from her. Friends of Slimmer disputed that interpretation, noting there was no romantic relationship between Slimmer and Shipp beyond friendship. That jealousy, mixed with the intensity of young relationships and group dynamics, likely helped fuel an atmosphere that turned lethal. Pike, Shipp, and Peterson had earlier signed out together under the pretense of getting marijuana, a ploy that brought Colleen long but led her into harm's way instead. Pike and her companions were arrested within days. Within a year, Pike was convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder in Knox County, Tennessee. Her sentence? Death. A sentence imposed when jurors weighed the brutality of the crime against any mitigating factors presented by her defense. Shipp received a life sentence with the possibility of parole, while Peterson, who cooperated with investigators, received a lesser sentence. In the decades since, Pike's legal team has argued that her age and mental health issues, including a history of abuse and later diagnoses of bipolar disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder, should have spared her from execution. Her attorneys have sought commutation or legal relief based on those mitigating factors. But in September 2025, the Tennessee Supreme Court denied her request for commutation and set her execution date for September 30th, 2026. If carried out as scheduled, Pike would be the first woman executed in Tennessee in more than 200 years and the only person put to death in the state for a crime committed at age 18 since the modern death penalty era began. Her case remains controversial, not just because of the violence of the crime, but because of her age, psychological background, and the broader debate over how justice should treat youthful offenders.
Charles Victor Thompson. In 2026, the state of Texas plans to execute Charles Victor Thompson for a crime committed in 1998, the fatal shooting of his ex-girlfriend and the man she had just moved on with. It was a single night of rage that ended 2 lives and sealed Thompson's place on death row. In 1998, Charles Victor Thompson was a young man struggling with the end of a relationship. He had recently broken up with Denise Hayslip, a woman he had been romantically involved with. Friends and court testimony later described the breakup as emotionally volatile. Thompson did not accept the separation easily, and he was deeply affected by the fact that Hayslip had begun seeing someone else. That man was Darren Keith Kane. By the spring of that year, all 3 were connected by unresolved emotions, jealousy, and growing tension. On the evening of April 29, 1998, Thompson went to Hayslip's apartment in Harris County, Texas. Kane was there with her. What began as a heated argument quickly escalated. Neighbors called police after hearing shouting and disturbance inside the apartment. Officers arrived, separated the parties, and ultimately allowed Thompson to leave. No arrests were made. But the conflict did not end when Thompson walked away. Court records show that Thompson left angry, humiliated, and emotionally charged, a state of mind that would intensify over the next several hours. In the early morning hours of April 30th, 1998, Thompson returned to the apartment, this time armed with a handgun.
According to trial testimony, he forced his way inside. The first person he encountered was Darren Kane. Thompson shot Kane multiple times. Kane died at the scene. Thompson then turned to Denise Hayslip, the woman at the center of the conflict. Before pulling the trigger, Thompson threatened her. He then shot her in the face. Hayslip survived the initial gunshot and was rushed to the hospital. Her family later made the decision to remove life support. The medical examiner ruled her death a homicide caused by the gunshot wound. After the shootings, Thompson fled the scene. He disposed of the gun by throwing it into a creek and went to a friend's house where he fell asleep. When he woke, Thompson told the friend what he had done. He then contacted his father, who drove him to the police station. Thompson surrendered without resistance. In 1999, a Harris County jury convicted Thompson of capital murder and sentenced him to death. That sentence was later overturned due to a procedural error, but a second jury resentenced him to death in 2005. Over the next 2 decades, Thompson pursued multiple appeals. Each was denied. The U.S. Supreme Court declined to intervene. Charles Victor Thompson is scheduled to be executed by lethal injection on January 28, 2026, unless a last-minute legal stay is granted.
Cedric Ricks. In March 2026, a Bedford man condemned for a family tragedy will face execution. But the story he leaves behind involves not just violence, but children who survived and testified. Cedric Allen Ricks was 38 years old in May 2013 when his life, and the lives of a family he once lived with, changed forever. At the time, he shared a child with Roxanne Diane Sanchez, who was then 30 years old. Sanchez had 2 older sons from a previous relationship, 8-year-old Anthony Reyes Figueroa and 12-year-old Marcus Figueroa, all living together in a Bedford apartment. Friends and family described Ricks and Sanchez as having a turbulent relationship, marked by arguments and a protective order that had been filed against Ricks earlier that year after he allegedly choked Sanchez and one of the older boys. On May 1, 2013, Sanchez had returned home with her 3 young sons after a routine trip to a grocery store. For Sanchez and her boys, the evening should have been ordinary: dinner, laughter, bedtime routines. But earlier that evening, neighbors heard shouting and profanity coming from the apartment, signaling an argument that would rapidly turn deadly. Inside, Ricks and Sanchez's disagreement turned physical. According to official court briefs, Ricks pushed Sanchez to the ground and began attacking her. When Sanchez's sons tried to intervene to protect their mother, the violence did not stop. It spread. Court records and survivor testimony paint a horrifying portrait of that night. Sanchez was repeatedly stabbed, suffering fatal wounds to her neck and chest. Anthony, the 8-year-old, was also stabbed and died from multiple wounds. Marcus, just 12, was stabbed 25 times but managed to survive. His injuries were severe, 25 separate stab wounds, but he later testified at trial about how he lay still after mimicking the sounds his younger brother made, convincing Ricks to stop his attack. Meanwhile, a 9-month-old infant, Ricks and Sanchez's youngest, was present in the home but was not injured. This was not a brief 1-minute episode of violence. Marcus's testimony detailed how the attack unfolded inside the apartment, from the initial argument to the moment Ricks left the scene, showered, packed a bag, and drove off in Sanchez's vehicle. That contrast, children crying for help, one dead, one gravely wounded, another too young to understand, is part of why this case remains haunting in the public record. After fleeing the scene, Ricks called relatives and confessed to what he had done. Law enforcement traced his cell phone and arrested him without incident in Oklahoma. In May 2014, a Tarrant County jury deliberated just 45 minutes before convicting Ricks of capital murder in the deaths of Sanchez and Anthony. They then spent 7 hours determining that only the death penalty would suffice.
During the sentencing phase, prosecutors detailed Ricks's history of violence in intimate relationships, including testimony from a neuroscientist and from his own mother. Ricks has sought relief in both state and federal courts. His legal team has raised multiple constitutional claims, including arguments about witness testimony, evidentiary issues, and alleged Fourth Amendment violations related to how evidence was obtained. Texas courts, including the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, have rejected these claims, and the U.S. Supreme Court has declined to intervene. As of late 2025, no execution stay has been issued, and Ricks's appeals have been exhausted. Cedric Ricks is currently scheduled for execution by lethal injection in Huntsville, Texas, on March 11, 2026.
Gary Wayne Sutton. On December 3, 2026, Tennessee is scheduled to carry out the death sentence of a man whose conviction stems from a double murder that shocked a small community and whose advocates say crucial evidence may be flawed. Gary Wayne Sutton grew up in East Tennessee. By 1992, he was 27 years old and part of a close-knit circle of friends that included Tommy Griffin, a man described in community accounts as sociable and well-liked. On the afternoon of February 21, 1992, Sutton and Griffin spent hours together at a local bar called Howie's Hideaway Lounge with another man, James Dellinger, who was not only Sutton's uncle, but also a close companion that night. Witnesses described the three of them as drinking and playing pool, seemingly without hostility. The night that followed would unravel friendships and lead to one of Tennessee's most controversial death penalty cases. Later that evening, Tommy Griffin's body was found near the Blue Hole area of Blount County, a scenic riverside location outside Maryville. He had been shot in the back of the neck with a shotgun, a wound forensic experts described as instantly fatal. Just days later, law enforcement discovered another body, Connie Brainham, Griffin's sister, inside her burned vehicle in a nearby wooded area. Investigators determined her death resulted from the fire that engulfed her car after someone set it intentionally. The twin discoveries sent shockwaves through the rural community. 2 young lives ended, one dead amid flames in a wrecked car, the other lying face down near a riverbank. Charged alongside Sutton was his uncle, James Dellinger. Prosecutors argued that the bloodshed was a premeditated act, not a rogue shooting or an unfortunate accident. Sutton and Dellinger were arrested and tried in Blount County shortly after the murders. Prosecutors presented evidence connecting the killings to the pair, including ballistic links between shells found at the scene and weapons linked to Dellinger. Despite the close friendship Sutton claimed to have with Griffin, jurors convicted both men of first-degree premeditated murder. The trial record shows that they were sentenced to death based on the jury's determination that the aggravating circumstances, such as the deliberate nature of the killings and Sutton's prior violent history, outweighed any mitigating factors. Friends and family of Griffin and Brainham told local media at the time that they were devastated by the loss of their loved ones and hoped the verdict would bring closure. What sets Sutton's case apart from many others on death row is that he has continued to proclaim his innocence for decades. His defense team argues that the evidence used to convict him was significantly flawed, particularly the forensic testimony of a state medical examiner whose credibility was later challenged and whose license was revoked for unrelated issues. Sutton's attorneys and supporters also contend there was no clear motive linking him to the murders of his friend and his friend's sister, and that key physical evidence was circumstantial rather than direct. Moreover, supporters have highlighted claims that Sutton has an intellectual disability, a factor that legal advocates say should have precluded his execution under evolving legal standards regarding the execution of individuals with significantly impaired mental capacity. To this day, family, friends, and legal advocates continue to mount efforts to revisit the case, challenge the forensic evidence, and push for clemency or a new hearing, even as the execution date looms. As it stands, in late 2025, the Tennessee Supreme Court has formally reset Gary Wayne Sutton's execution for December 3, 2026, after a multi-year pause in executions in the state ended with updated lethal injection protocols. No last-minute stays or new appeals have been reported at this time.
Tony Von Carruthers. On May 21, 2026, Tennessee plans to execute a man whose case became one of the most dramatic and legally tangled death penalty trials in the state's history. A case marked by graves literally dug in a cemetery, a defendant forced to represent himself, and decades of claims about legal incompetence and innocence. In 1994, Tony Von Carruthers was a 27-year-old man living in Memphis, Tennessee. On a night in February 1994, Carruthers, along with an accomplice identified in court documents as James Montgomery, became involved in what investigators described as a kidnapping and murder in Shelby County, Tennessee. Prosecutors later presented the sequence like this. Carruthers and Montgomery confronted Marcellus Anderson, his mother Delois Anderson, and Frederick Tucker, all acquaintances from the Memphis area. They were taken against their will to Rose Hill Cemetery, a quiet burial ground just outside the city. At the cemetery, the three victims were shot or otherwise killed, and then, in a detail that would shock jurors and the public, their bodies were buried in an open grave before a casket was lowered over them. Jurors were told that the mother, 43-year-old Delois Anderson, was still alive when she was placed in that grave, an agonizing detail highlighted by prosecutors as evidence of cruelty and premeditation. Whether the intent was robbery, retaliation, rivalry, or something darker was central to the prosecution's narrative. The level of planning, from luring the victims to a desolate area to disposing of their bodies in such a macabre way, became grounds for the most serious charges the law allows. Carruthers and Montgomery were arrested shortly after the bodies were discovered. Before his trial, Carruthers went through a series of court-appointed attorneys. Court records show that Carruthers repeatedly clashed with those attorneys. He demanded others be provided, threatened several of them, and ultimately the trial judge allowed him to represent himself, a decision with profound consequences in capital proceedings. In 1996, a Shelby County jury convicted Carruthers on 3 counts of first-degree premeditated murder for the deaths of Marcellus Anderson, Delois Anderson, and Frederick Tucker. He was sentenced to death for each conviction. His co-defendant, Montgomery, was also sentenced to death, but later developments in appeals and post-conviction litigation would take different paths for each man. Carruthers' case did not end with his conviction. He pursued post-conviction relief, raising multiple claims, from allegations of ineffective assistance of counsel to constitutional challenges based on being compelled to represent himself. His lawyers argued that forcing him to proceed without adequate representation, especially in a capital trial with life or death consequences, was a denial of his Sixth Amendment rights. The Tennessee courts, however, repeatedly upheld the convictions and sentences, finding the evidence and procedures legally sufficient and rejecting challenges to the trial court's decisions. In the decades since the verdict, Carruthers himself and some advocates have continued to assert his innocence and question the fairness of the original proceedings, particularly his ability to competently defend himself without counsel. As of late 2025, the Tennessee Supreme Court has formally scheduled Tony Carruthers' execution for May 21, 2026, to be carried out by lethal injection unless otherwise stayed by the courts or an executive intervention occurs. No public stay or commutation has been reported at this time.
Melvin Bonnell. In the early morning hours of November 28, 1987, Cleveland was quiet. But inside a small apartment on Bridge Avenue, something terrible was about to unfold. At about 3 a.m., someone knocked at the back kitchen door of the shared residence where 23-year-old Robert Eugene Bunner lived with 2 roommates. When Bunner opened it, the man on the other side wasn't a friend. It was Melvin Bonnell. Accounts from trial and appeal records describe what happened next in chilling detail. Bonnell walked into the apartment and, without hesitation, pulled out a firearm and shot Bunner at close range, twice. After Bunner fell, Bonnell didn't stop.
According to the Ohio Supreme Court's decision affirming the conviction, he continued to shoot and then left the scene, leaving witnesses horrified and Bunner gravely wounded inside. Paramedics later found Bunner dead. DNA testing conducted more than 2 decades later confirmed that blood found on Bonnell's jacket matched Bunner's, reinforcing the prosecution's case. Bonnell was quickly arrested and brought to trial. In 1988, a Cuyahoga County jury convicted him of aggravated burglary, felony murder with firearm and aggravated burglary specifications, aggravated murder, also with firearm and burglary enhancements. Following the verdict, the same jury recommended that Bonnell be sentenced to death, and the trial judge agreed. The conviction and sentence held up on appeal. The Ohio Supreme Court characterized the evidence as overwhelming and rejected challenges to the verdict and the death penalty. But Bonnell did not quietly accept his fate. Years after the trial, in the mid-1990s, Bonnell returned to court, arguing that prosecutors had failed to turn over evidence that might have helped his defense, from police and laboratory reports to biological evidence found at the scene. He claimed that key items were either improperly preserved or never tested at all. These claims formed the backbone of multiple post-conviction relief, all of which were denied. Appeals courts ruled that either the evidence in question had been adequately disclosed or that Bonnell failed to show that any missing information could have changed the trial's outcome. In the early 2000s, Bonnell renewed his fight by seeking DNA testing on several pieces of physical evidence, including vomit found near the body, blood inside his car, and other potential biological material. Prosecutors opposed this, noting there was no sample from the victim necessary for comparison. The Ohio Supreme Court ultimately rejected the DNA testing request in 2018, affirming that Bonnell had not shown the tests could prove his innocence. Across the years, from state appeals to federal habeas petitions, courts repeatedly denied relief. A federal appeals court upheld denials of his attempts to challenge his conviction as recently as the mid-2000s. As of the most recent capital crimes records, Bonnell remains on Ohio's death row. His appeals have been exhausted, and court records list him among inmates with final legal obstacles cleared and execution dates set. Publicly available rosters show Bonnell's earliest scheduled execution is November 18, 2026. Efforts to carry out executions in Ohio have stalled in recent years, in part due to difficulty obtaining lethal injection drugs, but Bonnell's case continues to be among those listed for future execution once state procedures allow.
Jerome Henderson. Imagine walking into your home, believing you're safe, only to face a nightmare no one could foresee. For 26-year-old Mary Akoff, that nightmare became real on March 3, 1985, in Cincinnati, Ohio. It was late evening when Henderson forced his way into Mary's home. According to court records, he committed aggravated murder, burglary, and attempted rape. Mary, a young woman described as vibrant and full of life, had no warning. The attack was sudden and violent. When authorities arrived, the scene told a grim story of a life violently ended and a home shattered. DNA evidence recovered later would link Henderson directly to the crime, sealing the case against him. Henderson's trial moved quickly. On July 17, 1985, a jury found him guilty on all counts. The evidence was overwhelming. Eyewitness accounts, forensic evidence, and DNA all pointed to Henderson. The sentence? Death. The court wanted to send a clear message. Crimes like this would face the ultimate consequence. Henderson didn't accept this quietly. Over the next decades, he filed numerous appeals challenging his conviction and the procedures used in his trial. But every attempt was rejected, and the death sentence stood firm. For more than 35 years, Henderson has been housed at Ross Correctional Institution, awaiting the state's final decision.
His execution was originally scheduled for September 14, 2023, but Governor Mike DeWine issued a reprieve amid ongoing legal challenges with Ohio's lethal injection protocol. Henderson is now fighting under Ohio's serious mental illness law, hoping to have his death sentence commuted to life. This claim is still pending, leaving him in a legal limbo as the years tick by. The story of Jerome Henderson is a chilling reminder of how a single night can irreversibly alter lives. Mary Akoff's life ended violently, and for her family, there has been no closure, only decades of navigating a justice system determined to uphold Henderson's punishment while he fights for his own survival.
Danny L. Hill. Danny Hill didn't commit his capital crime in a home or during a robbery. He committed it while already incarcerated inside an Ohio prison, a setting designed to prevent exactly this kind of violence. By the time Danny L. Hill received a death sentence, he was already serving time in the Ohio prison system. Hill was not living freely in society when the crime that put him on death row occurred. He was already under state supervision, housed, monitored, and confined. That context would later become central to how prosecutors framed the case. Because this was not a crime that slipped through the cracks of policing. It was a crime that happened inside the system itself. The victim in Hill's case was another inmate, someone he knew through daily prison life. According to court findings, the two men were not strangers forced together for a single moment. They shared space, routines, and the constant pressure that defines incarceration. Prosecutors later argued that tensions between the two men escalated over time, fueled by the volatile environment of prison, where disputes are rarely isolated and often intensified by stress, reputation, and survival instincts. There were no witnesses who stepped in fast enough, no alarms that stopped what came next. At some point during their incarceration, Hill attacked the other inmate. The assault was fatal. Medical and forensic testimony established that the killing was intentional, not accidental, a key factor that elevated the charge to aggravated murder, even though it occurred behind bars. This wasn't a fight that went too far. It was a deliberate act of lethal violence carried out in a place where the state is responsible for every person inside. What set Hill's case apart was not just the killing, but where it happened. Prosecutors argued that murdering someone while already incarcerated demonstrated an extreme threat to others and to institutional order itself. The jury agreed. Hill was convicted of aggravated murder and sentenced to death, becoming one of the few Ohio inmates condemned for a killing committed inside prison walls. Hill pursued appeals in Ohio courts, but his conviction and sentence were upheld. Like other Ohio death row inmates, his case is now stalled by the state's broader halt on executions. Ohio has not carried out an execution since 2018, citing execution drug access problems, ongoing litigation, administrative and legal barriers. As a result, Hill remains sentenced to die, but with no execution date in effect. Danny Hill's case forces a rare and uncomfortable question. What happens when the most severe crime occurs in the one place designed to stop it?
If these stories moved you, share your thoughts below in the comment. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell if you want more stories that challenge our ideas about crime, punishment, and humanity. Thank you for watching Verdict Vault. Until next time, stay thoughtful, stay compassionate, and keep seeking the truth.